So here we are literally at the top of the Westfield watershed, the Westfield River watershed. We're on the top of the west branch of the Westfield River. And a watershed is an area of land, if you can imagine it, the raindrops that fall over there will flow into tributaries, which flow into the Westfield River and exit in Westfield, where it goes into the Connecticut River. Just about 100 feet that way, we go over the crest of a hill, and we would be going into the Housatonic River watershed. The rain over there flows into the Housatonic. So at the top of the Westfield River watershed, any of the seeds here, if they're things that could be transported by water, could end up in the streams and tributaries and eventually make their way downstream, thus spreading the problem invasives. So if we can manage for the invasives at the top of the watershed, maybe we'll be helping all those towns down below. Let's see what we can find. So here we're seeing one of the very common species of invasive species here, and we're seeing it in fruit, which is really helpful in identifying it. First of all, what we noticed is that the leaves are opposite. The leaves and branches are growing opposite. There's kind of a limited number of bushes that grow like that. The viburnums being one of them, but this is which is native. But this is honeysuckle. If you were to cut one of the stems, we would see that the stems are hollow. But here, if we just kind of bend this down and look more closely at the fruits, we see some other differences here. Notice the fruits are in pairs. There they are. They're almost attached to each other, really. And we see them in pairs. That's classic of all of the honeysuckles everywhere we look here. They're in twos. And they're very tight to the stem. There's a very short peduncle or stem on the fruits. If we were to pick one of these, and I squeeze it to get the seeds out, notice there's not a large seed in here. Most of our native species, the viburnums, will have one large seed that's like a plate. It's flat and goes across the whole fruit. This one instead has many small seeds within it. Here, I've broken off one of the larger branches here. And if we notice here, it's got a brown pith, or it's actually kind of hollow in the center. Our native honeysuckle is a much smaller bush. We have a couple of different ones, but they're much smaller. And they won't have a hollow stem. So all the invasive ones, all the exotic ones, not native to the area, will not have a hollow stem like this. So these invasives very often produce a lot of berries and a lot of fruits, and the birds and other wildlife haven't adapted to eating these berries. They haven't evolved together, and thus many of the animals can't digest them very well. So they pass through the system very quickly, and the birds fly away and then defecate and leave the seeds out throughout the land, so they spread very easily. One of the things that makes them an invasive is that they're very successful at colonizing areas and growing, and then they grow so densely that they inhibit the growth of many other species below and around them. They also have to have successful fertile fruits that enable them to spread to another area rather than just spreading clonally through their roots. And so this honeysuckle is very effective that way, producing a lot of fruits and being spread by birds. Well, here we are on Savory Brook at the top of the west branch of the Westfield River. This is all part of a federal designation of river called the Wild and Scenic. And this is a tributary where we've been doing some work in managing invasive species. And we haven't found lots of them, but unfortunately we are finding some now and again. So we're going to keep an eye out for any invasives as we go along and anything else we find. And oh, look at that. Wow, fabulous. You know, every day it's about getting out into nature. You never know what you find. Often you don't see wildlife because you're making too much noise, perhaps. But here you can see some sign of it. Look at the claw marks here. We see here, yep, I see several of them. They're going right up the tree. We see the toes digging in, scratching the tree, as it looks like a young bear must have climbed this tree at some point and was scared by something, but I'm glad he got away. Well, we'll go on to see what we can find here. And unfortunately, oh, I'm seeing things already. One that we've already been dealing with quite a bit is our Japanese knotweed, and this would be a good population to remove because there's so little of it here that from what it appears to be, that if we could take just some of this away, then maybe there wouldn't be any at all. I haven't seen any, but I do see this big guy in back of it. So what we have here is glossy buckthorn. We can see that it's really coming into fruit. We have lots of it here. Let's look at what tells me it's glossy buckthorn. Well, here's kind of the obvious part a little bit, is when I look at the leaves, and they're very smooth and green and quite glossy or shiny leaves there. Very often the petioles will, the stem portion that goes to the leaf will be a bit red on all of them. And here we're seeing the fruits. They can look an awful lot like many of the cherries, but we notice here that the fruits are growing pretty much right off of the branches. So they're kind of growing individually off of the branch, and there are leaves mixed in with them. We see that they're light greenish yellow at the beginning, then they turn kind of an orangey reddish, and then eventually will turn black when they are fully matured. If I pick one of these, there we go. We see we get several seeds. There's 3 in here. Cherries are just going to have the one pit. And if you look carefully, these are a little bit flattened. They're flatter than a very round cherry pit, but similar in color. So these have multiple seeds. At times they can be only one, but they'll have multiple seeds, and they're generally flatter than a cherry pit. So this is glossy buckthorn, Frangula alnus. There is also common buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica, and then we also have a native buckthorn, which is similar and also will grow in wetlands, but far less common. Find it up north a little bit more. So the fruits on this, a lot of people will see these and think just great food for the birds. And unfortunately, our species of birds that live here haven't evolved along with this plant. And so this plant has kind of a chemical defense system which makes them undigestible by the birds. So the birds can load up with eating a lot of these berries, fill their stomachs, but they're not able to digest them. And they will pass very quickly through their system, and thus spreading the seeds all over. So the birds fill up, they get the sensation of being full, and yet they're not able to break down these fruits and assimilate, take in the nutrients there. So they're full, but they're not getting fed, essentially. So not really a good food source for the birds, but it's an effective way of distributing their seeds, and thus we find them in this fairly remote area, really. And we've got the buckthorn problem. So here we're looking at one of the plants that could be a look-alike for the glossy buckthorn. It's the chokecherry, and most of the other cherries would look like this as well. But as we look more closely, we notice that the leaves aren't really all that glossy. They're still pretty smooth, but just a different texture. But when we look at the fruits, we can see a real difference here. And if I isolate these a little bit, we see that there really aren't any, we see a cluster of fruits and no really leaves integrated with them. There's many of them. So rather than kind of coming off the stem individually, we have a whole cluster at the very end, and there's no leaves within those. So this is chokecherry, and very different. And if I take one of these, and like we did the buckthorn, I squeeze it. I'm going to be careful not to lose my seed here, because that's what we want to look at. And not surprising, being a cherry, we see that the fruit is a similar color, but you can see that it's quite a bit rounder and much more of a cherry pit. So that's what you want to look for, is the difference in the fruiting, in the pattern up here, and of course the ripened buckthorn will turn black altogether. We have no blackberries here. Well, here we are next to a big specimen of a species that can be quite prevalent, one of our invasive species. This is known as autumn olive. It's more of a shrub kind of species. There is another Russian olive that is a tree, but this is a shrub species. Very common along highways and some of the public areas where people had planted it at some point years ago. And it's distinctive in its very silvery leaves. We see the light on that, and even the tops are very silvery. But then when I turn them over, you really can see how light they are. It's more than just white, it's really kind of a gray silvery color when it catches the light. And the berries on this are quite distinctive as well. These haven't ripened yet or matured, but we see lots of them growing along the stem in these little clusters. But notice they're still quite close to the stem. And later on they become a bit of an orange color that also has a little bit of a silvery coating to them. They're delicious. You can eat. People can eat them. They do have a kind of large seeds, but you just smush them and they can be quite tasty, and people make all sorts of fruit products with them. But unfortunately the birds love to eat them too and take them all over. I don't know how well they digest these, but many other species that they have not evolved with are not very digestible by our native bird species. But in any case, it's an effective way of distributing the fruits and the seeds throughout the rest of the land, and so it spreads like crazy. And we're on a very nice property that we have found that there's many of them spread throughout the area, unfortunately, and they will continue to do so. Yeah. Well, so here we are on Savory Brook up by Frost Road in Washington, and come into the woods and find a little bit of an unusual tree. Many know generically, but they don't know the specific ones because they're quite a challenge. You'll notice that this tree has really large thorns, long thorns. Sometimes they're just shorter thorns, and then a cluster of flowers here at the ends of the branches. In the rose family, this is Crataegus, or the hawthorn. These will grow haws, which are kind of like a crab apple. It's a little drier or mealier, kind of a white flesh, and not something that you would eat, really, but a really neat plant with, look at the length of those spines here, really long thorns on that. The hawthorn, Crataegus.